It all started with a young couple, Sarah and James, who seemed like the perfect match. They were once inseparable, filled with dreams of a bright future together. Their love story began with sparks, a deep connection, and a shared belief that they were meant to be. They got married young and settled into their new life with joy. For a while, everything seemed perfect. But as time passed, things started to change. At first, it was small things. James started working longer hours, coming home late, and when he did, he was tired and distant. Sarah, feeling the distance between them grow, tried to keep their relationship alive. She would cook meals, plan weekends away, and suggest romantic dates, hoping to rekindle the spark they once had. But nothing seemed to work. It was like a wall had gone up between them, and she couldn't figure out why. James, on the other hand, felt overwhelmed. He had always been the kind of person who worked hard to provide for his family. But lately, he was feeling disconnected and confused. His job was demanding, and he began questioning whether he was on the right path in life. As much as he loved Sarah, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was missing. He started to feel trapped in the routine of life, burdened by responsibilities that he didn't feel equipped to handle. He longed for freedom, space, and a life without the weight of expectations. One evening, after another quiet dinner, James finally sat Sarah down. His face was serious, his mind made up. He told her that he needed to leave. The words were sharp, like a cold wind cutting through the warmth of their home. He said he needed time to figure things out, to find himself again. Sarah was stunned. She didn't see it coming. How could he just leave? They had built a life together, had dreams of growing old side by side. She tried to understand, but the pain in her chest was too strong. She begged him to stay, to work things out, but James seemed firm in his decision. With a heavy heart, he packed his things. Sarah watched him go, unable to speak. She felt the world around her crumble. In that moment, everything she had hoped for and worked toward seemed to slip away. She sat down in silence, unsure of what the future would hold. She was left with a deep sense of loss, wondering if there was something more she could have done. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah tried to move on. She focused on her work, her friends, and trying to rebuild her life. But nothing seemed to fill the empty space James left behind. She missed him terribly, but she also felt a quiet resentment building inside her. He had chosen to leave, leaving her to pick up the pieces of their broken life. It wasn't just about missing him. It was about the way he had walked away without looking back. James, meanwhile, had no idea how much pain he had caused. He was off in a new world, free from the weight of his past, trying to figure out who he was. The choice he had made was difficult, but it felt like the only option at the time. The future seemed uncertain, but he thought it was the only way to find peace. Neither of them knew just how much their lives were about to change. In the weeks that followed, Sarah had to face life without James. The silence in their home was deafening, and she could still feel the space where he used to be. At first, she thought the pain of his departure would consume her, but as the days passed, she realized she had no choice but to move forward. There was no other option. Sarah focused on herself, something she hadn't done in years. She threw herself into her work, taking on new projects and pushing herself harder than ever before. She had always been passionate about her career, but now it became her refuge. It helped her forget the emptiness she felt at home. Her friends and family noticed how strong she was becoming, but no one could understand the quiet sorrow that lingered behind her bright smile. As time went on, Sarah found solace in the small joys of everyday life. She began to rediscover things she had put aside when she was with James: old hobbies, forgotten passions, and even just quiet moments of peace. She took up yoga, joined a book club, and spent weekends hiking in the nearby mountains. Slowly but surely, she was rebuilding her life, piece by piece. There were moments when she missed James so deeply that it almost hurt to breathe. She would see a couple walking hand in hand, or hear a song on the radio that reminded her of their good times, and for a brief moment, she would feel that familiar ache. But she would push those feelings away. She knew that dwelling on the past wouldn't help her heal. She had to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult it was. It wasn't long before Sarah started to realize something important. She had forgotten who she was outside of her relationship with James. She had spent so many years focusing on their life together, trying to make everything perfect, that she had lost sight of her own identity. Now, with him gone, she was free to find herself again. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the sadness crept back in, but Sarah was starting to feel stronger and more confident than she had in years. Meanwhile, James was living his own new life. He had moved to a different city, far away from their old home. At first, he thought the change of scenery would help him forget about everything, but it didn't work as he had hoped. He threw himself into his job, met new people, and tried to stay busy. But at night, when everything was quiet, the loneliness set in. There were times when he would think of Sarah and wonder how she was doing. He missed her, but he couldn't bring himself to reach out. It felt like too much time had passed, and he wasn't sure if he could fix what he had broken. Though they were miles apart, both Sarah and James were growing in their own ways. It was clear that they were no longer the same people they had been when they were together. Their lives had changed, and as much as they tried to move on, the bond they once shared would never completely fade. However, both of them were learning that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about finding the strength to build something new. Sarah's life was no longer defined by the loss of James. She had found new purpose, new passions, and new people who supported her. Though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure. She was stronger than she had ever been before. Years passed, and life continued for Sarah and James, though in different directions. The pain of their separation had faded, replaced by the quiet rhythms of daily life. They had both built their own worlds, and while their memories still lingered, they had long stopped looking back. Sarah had grown stronger, finding peace in her new life. And James, though still uncertain of his own path, carried on with his decision, hoping it was the right one. For Sarah, each passing year became easier to navigate. She had built new friendships, found fulfillment in her work, and even traveled to places she had once only dreamed of visiting. With time, she realized she had become a version of herself she was proud of. The emptiness that had once consumed her heart slowly turned into a quiet contentment. She wasn't looking for love anymore, not in the way she had before. Instead, she found joy in small, everyday moments, like a cup of coffee on a quiet morning or a good book on a rainy afternoon. James, too, had settled into his new life. Though he had tried to move forward, there were still moments when he thought of Sarah. He would remember the way she smiled, or the way they used to talk for hours about their hopes and dreams. But those moments were fleeting. He had surrounded himself with work, friends, and new experiences, all to keep his mind from wandering back to the life he had left behind. As the years passed, neither of them expected their past to resurface. Neither of them was actively looking for a way to reconnect, and yet life has a way of surprising people when they least expect it. Neither Sarah nor James knew it yet, but fate had a plan in store for them, a plan that would bring them face to face once again. Sarah had long ago moved on from the idea of ever seeing James again. She had healed, and though the thought of him still occasionally crossed her mind, she had accepted that their story was over. She was content with the life she had built for herself, even if it wasn't the life she had once imagined. There were times when she wondered what might have been, but those thoughts were no longer a source of pain. They were simply part of the past. James, on the other hand, had stopped wondering about Sarah entirely. He had convinced himself that the decision to leave had been the right one, even though, deep down, a part of him still questioned it. He had been busy with his job, meeting new people, and even starting a few new hobbies. Yet there were moments, late at night, when he would reflect on the past, thinking about what he had left behind. Neither of them could have known that their paths would cross again, not by accident, but by a force much stronger than anything either of them could have imagined. Both Sarah and James had changed in ways they couldn't have anticipated, and the time was coming when they would have to face the truth of their past, even if they weren't ready for it. The years of silence were about to come to an end, and the chapter they had closed so long ago would be reopened. In the quiet, unspoken spaces between their lives, the possibility of change had always lingered. Neither of them was the same person they had been when they first parted ways, and neither could have predicted how their reunion would change everything. What had once seemed like a final separation now felt like the beginning of something new. One warm afternoon, as Sarah was walking through the city's bustling downtown area, something unexpected happened. She had just finished meeting with a colleague and was heading to a nearby cafe for a much-needed break. The sun was shining brightly, and people were going about their business, but for a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down for Sarah. She had been lost in thought, thinking about an upcoming project, when she suddenly froze. Standing just a few feet away from her was someone she hadn't seen in years, someone she never thought she'd cross paths with again. It was James. His face, though a little older, was as familiar to her as if no time had passed at all. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to stop. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her chest. She hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't even thought about him in a long time. James stood there, too, stunned. He couldn't believe his eyes. The woman he had once shared his life with was right in front of him, looking more beautiful than ever. Her smile was the same, and the same warmth in her eyes was still there, though now it was mixed with surprise and a hint of discomfort. He had heard about Sarah over the years. He knew she was doing well, but seeing her in person again, after all this time, brought a rush of emotions that he hadn't expected. "Sarah," James said, his voice unsure, almost like he wasn't sure she would recognize him. Sarah blinked, a bit disoriented, but she quickly found her voice. "James, I didn't expect to see you here." They stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. It was as if their history, all the time that had passed, and the emotions they had once shared were still lingering in the space between them. "I never thought I'd run into you like this," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence. She wasn't sure if she should smile or be serious. It felt awkward, and yet there was something strangely comforting about seeing him again. James shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I didn't expect it either, but here we are," he replied. He gave a small, somewhat nervous laugh, trying to break the tension. Sarah studied his face, noticing the subtle changes in him over the years. He looked older, more worn perhaps, but his eyes were still the same. She felt a rush of emotions, memories flooding back to her. For a moment, she almost forgot where she was, but then she remembered. She had built a life for herself. She was stronger now. She had moved on. After a brief pause, James spoke again. "How have you been?" His voice was sincere, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt a genuine curiosity in his words. It wasn't the same as before, when their conversations had been filled with assumptions and unspoken tension. Now it was different. His voice showed a longing to know how she was, how she had grown. "I've been doing well," Sarah replied with a soft smile. "Life has changed a lot, but I'm happy." James nodded. He wanted to say more, but the words didn't come easily. There was so much he wanted to ask, but he didn't know how to begin. Instead, he simply looked at her, taking in the sight of the woman he once knew so well. There was a strange sense of connection between them, as if the years of separation had somehow pulled them back to this one moment. Neither of them could have predicted this encounter, but now that it was happening, it felt like the start of something new, something neither of them could fully understand yet. But for now, they simply stood there, two people who had once been everything to each other, now strangers in a familiar way. As Sarah and James stood facing each other, the awkwardness between them began to shift. It wasn't just the unexpected meeting. There was something else in the air. A sense of curiosity grew between them. The years apart had shaped them into different people, but there was a longing to understand what had happened, to see what had become of the life they once shared. James cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had settled between them. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "So, what have you been up to all these years?" he asked, trying to sound casual but failing. There was so much he wanted to know, but it felt strange to ask after all this time. Sarah smiled faintly. She hadn't expected this question, but it made her realize how much had changed in her life since the separation. "Well," she began, "I've been doing a lot. I've kept busy with work and made a life for myself. It hasn't always been easy, but I've learned a lot along the way." James nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of how to ask the question that had been on his mind for the past few minutes. But before he could find the words, Sarah spoke again. "There's something I should tell you," she said, her voice a little quieter now, as though she was about to reveal something important. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he felt a wave of nervousness pass over him. He had no idea what she was going to say, but whatever it was, he could sense it would change things. "I had children," Sarah continued, her tone gentle but filled with a quiet strength. James blinked, momentarily stunned by the news. "I had quadruplets." James's mind struggled to process the words. Quadruplets. The very idea seemed impossible. He hadn't even known she was pregnant when they were together. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something, but the words just wouldn't come. "I know this probably sounds shocking," Sarah added, noticing the confusion on his face. "I didn't expect it either. When I first found out, I was scared. But now, they're everything to me." James took a deep breath, trying to absorb what Sarah had just shared. He could feel the emotions bubbling inside him, but he didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know," he managed to say finally, his voice shaky. He could see the pride and the love in Sarah's eyes as she spoke about her children, and it made him feel both happy for her and deeply regretful for not being there. "They're amazing," Sarah continued, a soft smile on her lips. "They're growing up fast, and honestly, they'd brought so much joy into my life. It wasn't easy raising them on my own, but I wouldn't change a thing." James stood there, unsure of what to say. He had always wanted a family, but the decision to leave had meant that he wasn't a part of Sarah's journey. He wasn't a part of the lives of the children she had raised. The thought weighed heavily on him. He realized he had missed so much. For a moment, Sarah paused, almost as if she was giving him time to catch up to the truth of what she had just shared. Then, with a sense of finality, she added, "They're part of me now, and they're part of the life I've built." James's heart felt heavy as the full weight of her words sank in. He had walked away from this family, from the chance to be there for Sarah and their children. He had no idea what it would mean to try to reconnect now, but one thing was certain. Everything had changed. James stood there, his mind racing. The news Sarah had just shared with him about the quadruplets was almost too much to take in. For years, he had lived with the idea that he had made the right choice by leaving, thinking that moving on was the best decision for both of them. But now, standing in front of Sarah, hearing about the children he never knew existed, he realized just how much he had missed. He had been so caught up in his own confusion and desires that he hadn't stopped to think about the consequences of his actions. As Sarah spoke about her children, the love and pride in her voice was undeniable. James could see it in her eyes, the way she lit up when she talked about her family. For a brief moment, he felt a sharp pang of regret. He had abandoned her, abandoned them, without ever knowing what he was giving up. The life they could have shared, the children they could have raised together, was now a reality that he could only look at from a distance. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? "I'm sorry" felt too small, too inadequate for what he had done. How could he apologize for something as big as this? How could he fix the pain he had caused? Sarah, noticing his silence, continued, "I know you didn't expect this, And I didn't expect it either. But life has a funny way of throwing surprises your way. It's been a roller coaster, but I've managed. There was a softness in her voice, but also a strength that James hadn't seen in her before. He realized then that Sarah had grown into someone who didn't need him, someone who had found her own way despite the challenges. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle between them. Then she added, "The kids, they're amazing. I don't regret anything. But I won't lie, it hasn't been easy. I did it on my own. And I'm okay with that now." James felt a lump form in his throat. He had always thought of Sarah as strong, but hearing her speak so openly about raising 4 children by herself made him admire her in a way he hadn't before. It wasn't just about being a mother. It was about the courage and resilience it took to face life's hardships without backing down. Sarah had become someone he didn't even recognize, and in that moment, he realized how little he had truly known her in the years they had spent together. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Sarah, I didn't know," he said quietly. "I had no idea." "I know you didn't," she interrupted gently, her voice full of understanding. "You made your choice, James, and I had to make mine." She looked away for a moment, taking a deep breath before looking back at him. "But I don't hold it against you. I've moved on. The past is the past." James nodded slowly, feeling both relieved and heartbroken. He was glad that Sarah didn't blame him for the decisions he had made, but the reality of what he had missed was a burden he wasn't sure he could bear. He had lost so much, and now he was left with nothing but regret and the uncomfortable feeling that it was too late to change anything. For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. James knew he had to make things right, but he wasn't sure how. He couldn't undo the past, and he couldn't take back the years they had lost. But one thing was clear. Meeting Sarah again had opened a door, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. All he knew was that he didn't want to walk away again. The conversation hung between them like a delicate thread, fragile and uncertain. James stood there, unsure of what to say next. The weight of the past, all the years they had spent apart, seemed to crash down on him all at once. Sarah had built a life, without him, and it was clear that she had done it well. But what about him? What was he supposed to do now? "I'm glad to hear the kids are doing so well," James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I can't believe you've managed everything on your own. I don't know how you did it." Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "You just do what you have to do," she replied. "There's no other choice. But I'm not here to make you feel guilty, James. I'm just telling you where I am now. I've made peace with everything." James nodded slowly, the guilt he had been carrying for so long still heavy on his chest. He had made the decision to leave, but he couldn't help wondering if he could have made a different choice. Could he have been there for Sarah? For the children? Would it have made a difference? The silence between them grew, and James could feel the tension building. He wasn't sure if he was looking for forgiveness, or if he just needed to understand why he had done what he did. But something inside him told him that now was the time to face the truth. There was no more running from it. He had to stop living in the past. "I made a mistake, Sarah," James said, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "I should have never left you. I should have tried harder to work things out. I can't change it now, but I need you to know that I regret everything. I regret walking away." Sarah's expression softened as she listened to him. For a moment, her eyes showed a glimmer of emotion, something James hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't anger or resentment, it was understanding. She could see that he was truly remorseful, and for the first time, it felt like they were on the same page. "James, I don't expect you to fix everything," Sarah said softly. "What happened, happened, but we can't go back and undo it. All we have is now, and I've moved on. I'm happy with my life, and the kids are everything to me." James swallowed hard, feeling the sting of her words, but he understood. She had moved on. She had built something for herself, and there was no easy way to undo the past. But still, something inside him told him he had to try. He couldn't just walk away again. This time, he wanted to be different. He wanted to show her that he could be there, even if it was just for the future. "I don't want to be a stranger in your life," James said, his voice more confident now. "I know I can't just walk in and expect things to be the same. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be a part of it. I'd like to know your kids. I'd like to make things right, even if it's just a little bit." Sarah paused, looking at him carefully. She could see the change in him. He wasn't the same man who had left her all those years ago. He was different now. She didn't know if it was too late to open up to him, but there was a part of her that wanted to believe it wasn't. "Let's take it one step at a time," she said finally. "I'm not sure what that means yet, but if you're serious about being part of my life again, we'll have to start slow." James's heart lifted, a sense of hope blooming inside him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew they had a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to build something new. A new chapter, one that didn't erase the past, but could lead to a better future. James left their meeting that day with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The conversation with Sarah had gone better than he had expected, but he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Sarah had agreed to take things one step at a time, but that was all he could ask for. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. In the days that followed, James reached out to Sarah again. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he wanted to show her that he was serious about being a part of her life. They exchanged a few messages, and slowly they began to reconnect, one small step at a time. James tried not to rush things. He knew that trust needed to be rebuilt, and that would take time. When they finally met again, it was at a local park, a place where families often gathered. Sarah had agreed to meet him, but only under the condition that they kept it simple. No pressure, no expectations, just a casual conversation. James understood. He didn't want to push her too hard, especially not after everything that had happened. When Sarah arrived at the park, she looked as calm and collected as always, but James could see a hint of hesitation in her eyes. He could understand why. Their past wasn't something you could just forget, but he hoped that with time, they could create new memories that would replace the old ones. Sarah said softly, giving him a small smile as she sat down on the bench beside him. "How have you been?" "I've been good," James replied, his voice sincere. "Just trying to figure things out. I'm glad we're doing this." For the next hour, they talked about everything and nothing. They talked about their work, their lives, and how things had changed over the years. James told her about some of the things he'd been through, the mistakes he'd made, and how he'd learned from them. Sarah listened carefully, nodding in understanding, but she didn't offer too much in return. She wasn't ready to open up just yet, and James respected that. This wasn't about diving into the past. It was about building a new connection. As they sat there, a family passed by with small children running ahead. Sarah's eyes followed them for a moment, and James couldn't help but notice the soft smile that appeared on her face. It was clear that she loved her children deeply, and he could only imagine the bond they shared. "I thought about it," Sarah said after a pause, her voice quieter now. "About the kids, I mean. They're everything to me. I've never wanted to be with anyone else in that way, but I don't know. Things are different now. I'm open to seeing where this goes, but I need time. You can't rush something like this." James nodded, taking in her words. "I understand. I'm not asking for anything right now, Sarah. I just want to be part of their lives, even if it's just a small part at first. I know I've missed a lot, but I want to be there." Sarah's eyes softened. She could see the sincerity in his words, and a small part of her believed him. She hadn't been sure if she was ready to let him back in, but hearing him speak like that gave her a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make it work. "Well," Sarah said, standing up from the bench, "we'll see how it goes. Let's start with small steps. James stood too, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning, and that was all he needed. One step at a time. He wasn't going to make the same mistakes again. This time, he was ready to build something lasting, something real. And maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other, one step at a time. As the days passed, James and Sarah continued to meet, slowly rebuilding a connection that had been lost years ago. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of awkwardness, but each meeting felt like progress. They didn't talk about the past much. Instead, they focused on the present, on the small changes that were happening between them. Sarah was still cautious, but she could see that James was trying, really trying, to be a part of her life. One afternoon, Sarah invited James to join her for a family outing. It was the first time he would meet her children, and he was nervous. He had imagined this moment many times, but now that it was real, he didn't know what to expect. Would her kids accept him? Would they see him as a stranger? He had no idea, but he knew he had to try. When they met at the park, Sarah's children were running around, playing with a group of friends. They were laughing, carefree, and full of energy. Sarah smiled at the sight of them, and James couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. These were the kids he had never known, the children he had missed out on. But seeing them, watching how they interacted with their mom, filled him with a sense of hope. They were her world, and in a way they were now a part of his too. "Hey guys," Sarah called out to her children. "Come over here. I want you to meet someone." The children looked up, curiosity in their eyes. They ran over to Sarah, stopping short when they saw James. The youngest one, a boy around 6 years old, stepped forward first, his wide eyes studying James carefully. "Are you the man Mom talks about?" he asked shyly. James smiled warmly. "I think so," he replied, kneeling down to be at eye level with the boy. "I'm James. It's nice to meet you." The boy hesitated for a moment, then smiled back. "I like your shoes," he said, pointing at James's sneakers. James chuckled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The boy's simple compliment made him feel like he had passed some unspoken test. One by one, the other children introduced themselves, and James could see the hesitation in their eyes slowly fading as they warmed up to him. Sarah watched the exchange with a soft smile on her face, proud of how well her children were adjusting. As the afternoon went on, James spent time with Sarah and her children, playing games, talking, and sharing stories. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. The laughter of the kids, the easy conversations, the sense of connection. It was all something James hadn't realized he missed so much. He could see now why Sarah had worked so hard to create this life for herself and her family. She had built something strong, something beautiful, and he was beginning to understand what it meant to be a part of it. By the end of the day, as the sun was setting, Sarah turned to James. "Thank you for being here," she said softly. "It means a lot to me. We're taking it slow, but I'm glad you're trying." James looked at her, his heart full. "I'll keep trying, Sarah. I want to be here for you and the kids. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to put in the work. One step at a time, right?" Sarah smiled, her eyes reflecting a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. "One step at a time," she agreed. For the first time in a long time, James felt like he had found a sense of purpose. He wasn't just trying to make things right for himself. He was trying to build something new, something that included Sarah and her children. It wouldn't be perfect, and there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make this new beginning work, one step at a time.